And then the next thing we got to was a river on. That was BU. They don't call it BU. We called it. It wasn't even a place. You were there. BU. We said the words as they looked on the paper. Like say, gone through where the war was, the Great War, in these places, there were, we didn't use the French word, we used the word that we see on paper. And we were saying, to pause your car, we'd say, pause your car, because you spelled it that way. So this is you in the Lord now, the river. I called them pause. Well, anyway, we got out on the open. And after we got up through, we got into this place. And here they captured a German unit, ambulance unit, and they handed them over to us. Because we were an ambulance unit in Holland. And here did a half track, a tank, like wheels at front, and I was in with the Germans, talking to them. They were quite nice. They were alright Germans, were like everybody else. They were called up in the army and they were glad to get captured, so they were. And they gave me a set of maps of the area. I had my set of maps, and that was alright. Well, we carried on after the tanks then, and here they found this place called Cleve, and we were through it, and they told the people of Cleve, we're going to bomb you, get out of the town, small town, and they planned it, they never left a stone standing, and they didn't need to bomb it because there was another road, you could bypass it. So I got a lot of wounded. I went down to Weird. We were wounded. That was the way back in Holland. And I come up during the night and I had this map. I said, well, I'm not going down to Cleve. I'm going up the Surrey Road. And damn it, the Germans used that road. And here was a bit to cut into the left to get there down. But we were, I don't know what the town was called. Nobody told us anything. Not the army. And here I got to this place, and a narrow path, and they started shelling me. Engine sound. The shells were landing, and I put the ambulance in the top gear, 4 gears, but the top gear was a big jump, and it was quiet. And I moved away in top gear slowly into the town. I couldn't turn because I used my mines at the grass. And here they kept shelling that mark where they had the engine. And I got into town and here they were fighting in the street. I was in the middle of the street and my arm was on my own. And here they were the British troops that were going from door to door, and I got up to the end of the street, and there was a garage, open doors, a small garage, and in the garage where these boys were sitting, and they had a Benghazi going. That's the fires they made in the army. You know what a Benghazi is. They were dumped sand and they poured the petrol on it, and they put fire on the top, and they put the pot on it, they boiled the water. I come to my desert, Benghazi, and I walked in and they were all sitting around and drinking tea. Faces were black and their eyes were staring. And I said to them, what do you call this place? And they were looking at me. Nobody would speak. And I spoke again, and then I spoke broad Scots. Broad Scots. One of them said, oh, I don't know, joke. They were Scotch. sitting in this garage drinking tea. And they asked me, do you want a cup of tea, Joe? I had a Vulcan to get in, it was terrible. They were enjoying it, and I drunk it. I wanted to let them see that I was equal to them. I was better. I was in a better state. I was cleaning that. It was dirty, but they were bumped up with bumping. And they were drinking tea and they were fighting outside the street. Well, anyway, when I got back, I found out that place was called Herr Toggenbusch. On the map, I got back with a scout car. He got lost too, and he got me out of town. What we did was he went to every corner and he stopped. It was a Daimler scout car. He was looking for his harbour. In the tanks, they didn't call it the base for the night, they called it harbour, because that was a shame.
How did you get back to France? The further we got there, you were up against the British, we know why they're called that.
Well, what happened, the bits of tank were called bits of ships, spontoons. They were things that opened up the battleship and fire the guns. The things that cover the tracks in the tank are called spontoons. The tank was called a tank.
Did the ambulance service get involved in it? This like here?
I was up there. I was among them. And here that scout car went in the front. And I followed him to the corner of the street. He looked round about and then he flashed his tail light. Then I went up to that corner and he moved to the next corner. And he flashed his lights and I moved up and he gradually got me out of town. And then I got back. Well, what happened? Afterwards, about 3 weeks after it, Montgomery knew that as far as the Germans were concerned, we were waiting to move into Germany. We were right on the border. He knew as far as Hitler was concerned, they were finished. And they started to let people get leave that landed at Normandy. Well, here I was told, you're going to leave. 3 weeks after that, I come home and leave. That's when Mary Jane died, my sister. She died then, that year. And here the news come on. And the news said, our troops have just entered Herr Toggenbusch. I said I was in there 3 weeks ago. And they were fighting in the street. 3 weeks ago I was in Herr Toggenbusch. But well, what happened then? Instead of the BBC poking their nose in and getting the news and the Germans getting their information, they never gave the BBC news until it was 3 weeks old. They were well back and it was no good to the Germans. And the people at home were quite happy. They got news. I was in Belgium.
Did you get to Belgium?
We went through Belgium.
Antwerp?
We went and captured Antwerp with the 11th Guards Armoured. We got to Paris and we were tearing along the road following the tanks. And here the signpost all the way was Paris. 30 kilometers. Paris, 25 kilometers. Oh, we're going into Paris. Oh, this is good. Here we got to Paris, 10 kilometers. Then the signpost said Paris, 20 kilometers. 25, and then there were no more sights. We bypassed Paris, and we had to go to Antwerp to capture Antwerp. So the tank was straight to Antwerp. We followed him. But what happened to Paris? Eisenhower was the overall Antwerp. That was it. There was nothing in Antwerp.
No possession.
The Germans had run away. When we got the Germans, they were running back all the time. They were running the away all the time, railways and everything.
But were the casualties going down in numbers?
No, there were no wounded then. Because the Germans were gone. But the Germans were still in the docks. And the gates were shut. They were outside the docks, but the Germans were inside. But the gates were shut. But it was no good to capture the docks because the river Shell, that was a river, got up to Antwerp. That was a delta. A delta is like your fingers on your hand, a lot of bits of land shut down. And on these, the deltas, the Germans had built armoured places with big heavy guns. So there was no point to get into the two docks and capture the docks until they got the Germans cleared from the river, from the delta. It had to be cleared.
You weren't involved, there wasn't much for ambulances at the time.
Not then. We were just sitting in the field because the Germans were going back. They ran away. But the Germans in the docks, we didn't know they were there. The gates were shut and they left them. There was no value capturing the docks if they couldn't get the boats up. It was common sense. So the delta had to be cleared, and that was a big job.
Where did you go for here with ambulances after that?
We went from Antwerp up to Arnhem. We went to Arnhem. Montgomery, before he got the overall command, he was in command of the 11th Guards Armoured. And the 11th Guards Armoured, they were Montgomery's pegs. When you're there, you got all the action. So we were sent up to Arnhem. And we were there pretty wounded by. And they couldn't hold Arnhem. They had to move out. The next thing we were sent to help the Americans and for another place where they broke through the Ardennes. We were sent
The ambulance corps.
with the tanks. Where the tanks go, we go. We were part of the 11th Armour, and we went to the Ardennes. And then the Germans, they ran out of fuel. They thought they could capture fuel, but what happened, the British, they blew up the dumps, the fuel dumps, so there was no fuel for them. And what they did was they took tanks off the Russian front to go to the Ardennes. The Germans did, because their plan was to separate the British and the Americans to cut through and get to Antwerp.
Were you involved in a lot of fighting with it?
We were.
Was ambulance service at this point being
We were there. And the ambulance unit were following the tanks.
So was there casualties?
No, there wasn't much.
Came at home.
They were wounded, but there wasn't a great deal. Well, I was getting wounded, but I wasn't getting the enormity because the Germans couldn't do much then because they had no fuel. On the leg, we got flying glass. I don't know what the town was called.
What happened? You winded?
There was flying glass in my leg down there. It got off me. And I was in the hospital. When the war was over in Europe, I was in Tournai in hospital. And what happened after you come out of hospital, you got your holding unit. After you're 6 weeks from your unit, you're scored off the books. You see? And after you come out of hospital, you're going on you go to one place like a glass house, a hardening company, and there's proper hell in there. Hell. You're racing about and everything to make it so unpleasant that you want to go back into battle. They don't make it cushy. You're wounded, you see. was on the wall every day on the names, and here, one day my name was on it. To see the sergeant major. And I go and knock his door and I go in. He was waiting on me. He said, you've done your share. The last number, there was the board number, and my number was 33. Well, anyway, my number was 33, and the sergeant major says, 33 number is the last one to go to Burma. And he said, you've done your share. You've been in the army 6 years. You've done your bit. You don't deserve to go to Burma. There's a nice job driving in Blankenburg near Ostend. I said, that'll do me fine. So I went to Ostend, to Blankenburg. That was a holiday place for Spitz. Belgium Spitz. And I was driving from the head hotel, driving everything, supplies, you mentioned it. I was the AU on the motor. But anyway, that shut down at the end of the season. And then I went up to Germany back to the Guards Armoured. And I ended up driving with the Guards Armoured, driving supplies, everything you mentioned it. Driving the Bedford truck, driving everything. And then I finished up there. And Nymunster. And Nymunster was a big town like Aldershot. Aldershot is a garrison town. Nymunster. That was a garrison in Germany. That was a garrison town. There was a whole lot of regiments in it.
The British Army?
Yeah.
Just a minute.
But that was the German army. Like Aldershot here. It was a garrison town, Nymunster. And then we took all these places over when we moved in. But the Germans were doing all the work. There were German cooks, there were German cleaners, German handymen, German guards. And we were told when we went into the place, now if you go out at night and you're coming back and that guard tells you to stop, you stop because they've got live ammunition, the German guards, and if you don't stop, they've been ordered to shoot you. So you stop. We don't want them as toys. They were the real German army. And the Germans liked that, of course. They were good. They were very smart. And if you went, we didn't go out, but if you went out at night and they tell you to hold, you hold. Because if you don't, they'll shoot you. They're carrying their own rifles and they're carrying live ammunition. And it wasn't toy soldiers.
Was this after the surrender?
After the war was over, the Germans. And now he said, "Do you stop?" Because they've got a job to do. There's no point having the guard. It's only an ornament. We made sure that the German army, it was a proper army. And they were getting well fed. Germans were starving. They were getting the same rations as we were getting. The uniforms on and then their own bills. They had their own beds and the power room. There was a British officer in charge of them. Now he was only there talking about, right, take us home next week tomorrow. And we went,
That's Bill Caroon. That's his story, a true story.
we got to
And I'm one of those Caroons, so I'm proud of it.